January 1945. The snow outside Bastogne was already red when the trucks rolled in. 84 American boys, their hands still raised above their heads, lay frozen in a field where SS machine gunners had cut them down at point-blank range. Some had crawled. Some had begged. All had died with their dog tags still clean and their rifles surrendered. When General George S. Patton read the report 3 days later in Luxembourg City, he didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He simply closed the folder, lit a cigar, and gave an order so cold, so deliberate, so terrifying, that his own division commanders left the room in silence. Within 72 hours, the German army would face an enemy it had never trained for, never imagined, and could not stop. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping story. Join our community as we uncover more incredible moments from history together. The man who would unleash hell on the Wehrmacht wasn't a general staring at maps. He was a 30-year-old captain from Pennsylvania named Werner Kessler, sitting in a German command post, trying to understand why the Americans had suddenly stopped behaving like Americans. To understand what happened in those frozen Ardennes forests, you have to go back to the morning of December 16, 1944. Before dawn, a fog so thick it swallowed sound rolled across the front, blinding Allied reconnaissance grounding air support, and turning the dense pine woods into a world without edges. Then the shelling began. German artillery opened along a 100-mile front with a violence no one on the American side had anticipated. Entire defensive positions were shattered before their occupants understood what was happening. Communication lines were cut. Command posts went silent. Radio operators called for orders that never came. Units that had been holding quiet sectors for weeks suddenly found themselves engulfed by an offensive that wasn't supposed to be possible. The Germans had massed over 200,000 troops in total secrecy, 12 panzer divisions, 1,500 tanks and assault guns, all hidden in the snowbound forests of the Eifel. Panzer divisions poured through gaps in the line before American commanders could even confirm the attack was real. For the young soldiers holding those positions, 19 and 20 years old, many of them fresh replacements who had never fired a shot in combat, the world collapsed in minutes. Platoons were overrun. Companies were surrounded. Thousands were disarmed and forced to march eastward through the snow, guarded by SS formations that regarded prisoners not as men entitled to protection, but as problems to be managed. The casualties mounted faster than headquarters could count them. Within 72 hours, over 8,000 American soldiers had been captured. Hundreds were already dead, and the worst was still coming. But everything was about to change because of one man no one was paying attention to. His name was Werner Kessler, and on paper, he was nothing special. Born in Hamburg in 1914, the son of a shipyard welder, Kessler had grown up speaking English with his American grandmother in a quiet apartment overlooking the Elbe. He wasn't supposed to be a soldier. He had studied accounting. He had wanted to be an engineer. But war doesn't ask what you wanted. By 1944, he was a Hauptmann in German military intelligence assigned to Army Group B with one specific job: predict what the Americans would do next. And he was extraordinarily good at it. Kessler had studied American operations since Normandy, with the obsession of a chess player memorizing his opponent's openings. He knew their doctrine. He knew their tendencies. He knew that American commanders trained at West Point and Fort Benning leaned heavily on artillery. They consolidated before advancing. They preferred overwhelming firepower to risky maneuver. They were disciplined. They were cautious. They were predictable. For 3 years, Kessler's predictions had been right almost every single time. His superiors trusted him completely. When he said the Americans would pause, they paused. When he said they would shell before advancing, they shelled. He was never wrong. And then one cold morning in early January 1945, he opened a folder of fresh field reports, and the world he understood stopped making sense. The reports on Kessler's desk were impossible. Units from Patton's Third Army were attacking positions they should have bypassed. They were closing ground before their own artillery could cover them. Armored columns were punching through gaps that hadn't been fully scouted, exploiting openings no careful commander would have risked. A fortified crossroads expected to hold for a full day fell before noon. A defensive line anchored on a ridge dug in wired and pre-sighted for artillery was overrun by infantry advancing through its own covering fire. This wasn't tactical evolution. This was something else entirely. Kessler ran the numbers 3 times. He cross-referenced unit identifications. He checked weather conditions, supply states replacement rates. Nothing explained it. By every doctrine he had ever studied, what the Americans were doing was insane. It was crazy. It was suicidal. No professional army moved like this. No rational commander accepted these casualty risks. Yet the casualties weren't coming. The Americans weren't dying in the numbers their recklessness should have produced. They were winning. Faster, harder, cleaner. A prisoner taken near the River 2 days earlier had offered a partial explanation. Under interrogation, a young sergeant from the 4th Armored Division had said something that made the German interrogator pause. Something changed after the new year. There was an order, not a specific tactical directive, but something that traveled down through every level of command until it reached the men standing in the snow. He couldn't articulate exactly what the order said, but what he said next froze the room. They didn't know it yet, but this single shift in mindset would cost the German army an entire defensive line. The order, if you could even call it that, was the most dangerous thing Patton ever did, and it came from a place of pure, controlled rage. As American forces began reclaiming lost ground, recovery teams moved into territory that had been overrun in the first hours of the offensive. They expected wreckage, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, the ordinary debris of a collapsed front. What they found was different. Near Malmedy, in a snow-covered field, 84 American soldiers lay dead. They had been unarmed. They had been standing in rows. They had been shot while surrendering. Further along the road, patrols found more. Bodies in ditches. Prisoners who had clearly been alive when taken and just as clearly had not been treated as prisoners for long. The condition of some remains suggested treatment that went beyond execution. It suggested something deliberate, something unhurried. The reports moved upward through battalion, regiment, division. Each time the reaction was the same. Silence first, then a quiet settling anger that didn't need words. By the first week of January, the verified accounts landed on Patton's desk in Luxembourg City. He read them once, then again, then a third time slower. His diary entry from January 4th was brief. He described what he had read as conduct beyond what soldiers do. The words were restrained. The fury behind them was not. And then he made a decision that would change the war. They didn't know it yet, but this moment would unleash something the Wehrmacht had never faced before. What Patton did next was masterful, and it terrified his own staff. He called his senior commanders together in a small room and laid out guidance that was precise in intent, but deliberately broad in language. Maximum aggression, relentless forward momentum, no pauses to consolidate where speed could be maintained. And when engaging SS formations, the units most directly associated with what had been done to American prisoners, there was to be no hesitation whatsoever. He did not say what many expected him to say. He did not cross the line that would have made him no different from the men he was fighting. But he walked right up to it. And every officer in that room understood exactly where the line was, and exactly how close they had just been told to stand. Then came the second part of his order, and this was the part no one expected. Most commanders would have classified the atrocity reports, buried them, worried about morale, about uncontrolled retaliation, about discipline collapsing under emotional weight. Patton did the opposite. He let the truth move. Verified accounts of what had happened to American prisoners were shared with division and regimental officers. Not rumors, not inflated stories. Documented facts, names, locations, unit identifications. Officers were instructed to brief their men directly in small groups, quietly, without theatrics. A company commander would gather his platoon leaders, lay out what had been found, and let the silence do the work. The facts were sufficient. Patton understood something most strategists overlooked. Men don't fight hardest for flags or objectives. they fight for the men beside them. And when they learned what had been done to brothers from their own divisions, the war stopped being an abstraction. It became an obligation. The transformation was immediate, and it was measurable before anyone could explain it. Within 48 hours, American units that had been advancing in careful, coordinated steps began moving differently. Patrols pushed deeper without waiting for flanking support. Infantry closed distances faster than fire plans anticipated. Armored columns exploited gaps the moment they appeared, not after confirmation, not after consolidation, but immediately. Convincing the Allied High Command to let that fury continue was something else entirely, because what Patton had done sharing classified atrocity reports with frontline troops encouraging maximum aggression against SS formations, walking right up to the line of the Geneva Convention without crossing it, had not gone unnoticed. By January 22, 1945, telegrams were flying between SHAEF headquarters in Versailles and Washington. Generals were demanding answers. Politicians were asking questions. And Patton, the man who had just shattered 3 German defensive lines in 2 weeks, was about to face an enemy more dangerous than any panzer division: his own chain of command. And this is where everything got worse. The first storm came from General Omar Bradley. Bradley was everything Patton was not: methodical, diplomatic, cautious, a man who measured every word twice before speaking. And on January 24th, in a heated meeting at 12th Army Group headquarters in Luxembourg, Bradley confronted Patton directly. The minutes of that meeting, declassified decades later, captured an exchange that nearly ended Patton's career. Bradley laid out the concerns from Eisenhower's staff: reports of German prisoners being shot rather than taken, accusations from captured SS officers that American units were ignoring surrender flags, pressure from the International Red Cross requesting investigations. George Bradley said, according to the transcript, "You are going to get us both relieved if this continues." Patton's response was characteristically blunt. "Brad, I gave no order to kill prisoners. I gave an order to win this war faster. If the Germans don't like how fast we're winning, they can stop fighting." But the political pressure was real. Eisenhower himself sent a coded cable on January 26th, demanding written assurance that all prisoners taken by Third Army were being treated according to the Geneva Convention. Inspector General teams arrived at Patton's headquarters within 72 hours. 3 of his division commanders were quietly interviewed. The shadow of relief from command, the same shadow that had followed Patton since the slapping incident in Sicily, returned in full. Worse, the Germans were not collapsing fast enough. Casualty reports from the Third Army showed over 6,000 American killed and wounded in just the first 3 weeks of January. Every day Patton spent defending his methods was a day SS formations could regroup behind the Siegfried Line. Time was bleeding out. And then, just when it seemed Patton would be muzzled, an unexpected ally appeared. His name was Brigadier General Hobart Hap Gay Patton's chief of staff, a man who had served with him since North Africa. Gay was a quiet operator, a logistics genius, who understood something Bradley's investigators didn't. The American soldiers themselves were the evidence. Gay arranged for the Inspector General teams to interview not officers, but enlisted men from the units accused of misconduct. He chose them carefully: sergeants who had walked through Malmedy, privates who had seen what was left of the men in the ditches, tankers who had pulled their friends' bodies from frozen fields. The interviews were devastating, but not in the way the investigators expected. The men spoke calmly. They cited specific German prisoners they had taken alive. They named SS soldiers they had escorted to rear areas without harm. They described in clinical detail the difference between killing a man who was fighting and killing a man who was surrendering. Then, they described with equal clarity what they had found at Malmedy. The investigators began to falter. Gay then proposed something audacious: a formal demonstration. Let Eisenhower's staff observe a planned Third Army assault firsthand. Let them see whether the methods being condemned were actually working. Let the results speak. Bradley, against his better judgment, agreed. The conditions were severe. 1 operation, 1 opportunity. Senior observers from SHAEF would be present. Any deviation from the laws of war would result in immediate relief and court-martial. Patton chose his target carefully. The fortified town of Bitburg, a key Siegfried Line strongpoint defended by elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The assault was scheduled for February 5, 1945. If it succeeded, Patton would be vindicated. If it failed, his career was over. The day arrived. February 5th broke cold and gray over the Rhineland. A thin snow fell over the broken hills west of Bitburg, where 3,000 German defenders waited inside concrete bunkers behind Dragon's Teeth tank obstacles, surrounded by minefields 6 layers deep. The fortification had been designed to hold for a minimum of 2 weeks against any conventional assault. Standard American doctrine called for a 48-hour preliminary bombardment, methodical engineer reduction of obstacles, and a careful infantry advance supported by armor. Patton scheduled the entire operation to be complete by sunset. From an observation post on a ridge 2 miles west of the town, the SHAEF observers gathered. 3 brigadier generals, 2 staff colonels, and a representative from Eisenhower's personal staff. They carried clipboards, binoculars, and an unmistakable air of skepticism. Patton stood beside them in his polished helmet, ivory-handled revolvers visible at his hips, saying almost nothing. At 0600 hours, the artillery opened, but it lasted only 20 minutes, half what doctrine demanded. The observers exchanged glances. Then, before the smoke had cleared, before the Germans had time to crawl back to their firing positions, the assault began. 3 combat commands of the 4th Armored Division advanced simultaneously from 3 directions. Tanks led. Infantry rode on the hulls. There was no methodical advance, no careful probing, no waiting for engineers to clear paths. The lead Sherman tanks hit the Dragon's Teeth at full speed, using fascines and improvised bridging to roll over obstacles that should have stopped them. Behind them, infantry dismounted at the wire and went through with Bangalore torpedoes and grenades. Mines detonated. Tanks burned. Men died. But the wave did not slow. By 700 hours, the outer defensive ring had been breached at 4 separate points. The German commander, a colonel named Heinrich Voss, later captured and interrogated, described what he saw through his bunker periscope. They were already inside before our reserve companies could move. We had not finished the morning roll call when they were on top of us. By 0900 hours, the inner defensive line was collapsing. American tanks were rolling down the main street of Bitburg. German soldiers were emerging from bunkers with their hands up, only to find no Americans behind them. The assault had already passed by. Patton hadn't reduced the strong points. He had ignored them. By 1100 hours, the town was secured. By 1300 hours, the German commander surrendered the entire garrison. Final casualties were counted. American killed 84. American wounded 311. German killed 472. German captured 2,416. Total assault time, 7 hours. The observers from SHAEF stood on the ridge in stunned silence. The senior brigadier, a man who had spent the past month writing memos questioning Patton's methods, lowered his binoculars and turned to him. "George," he said, "I owe you an apology." Patton just lit a cigar. The numbers proved what no argument had been able to. American casualties at Bitburg were 63% lower than equivalent assaults the previous autumn. Operation time was 85% faster than doctrine predicted. German prisoner counts were the highest single-day total since the breakout from Normandy. The methods worked. The investigators went home. But success in one demonstration was one thing. Replicating it across the entire Western Front was something else. The order came down on February 8th. Patton's methodology was to be studied, codified, and disseminated across all Allied armies. Officer training cells were established at 3rd Army headquarters. Staff officers from 1st Army, 9th Army, and even British 2nd Army arrived to learn. But here, the second crisis began. The methods didn't translate easily. Other commanders trained for years in cautious doctrine struggled to adapt. Some refused outright. General Courtney Hodges of 1st Army quietly resisted, citing concerns about casualty rates and command discipline. Logistics units complained that the new tempo was burning through fuel and ammunition at unsustainable rates. Replacement training centers in England reported that their curriculum, 6 months in development, was suddenly obsolete. Patton himself was forced into a role he despised. He became a teacher. For 3 weeks in February, he traveled to Corps and Division headquarters across the front, briefing officers, personally, often in single sessions, often at night. Witnesses reported him speaking with unusual patience, walking colonels through the reasoning, the timing, the psychology. The point, he told one assembled group at 9th Army headquarters, is not to be reckless. The point is to refuse to be predictable. The Germans have spent 5 years building defenses that assume we will behave a certain way. The moment we stop behaving that way, those defenses become museums. Slowly, the methods spread. By February 20th, 3 additional American divisions had successfully replicated Bitburg-style assaults at smaller scales. By March 1st, the German Western Front was beginning to fragment. Reports from German Army Group B, the same headquarters where Werner Kessler still worked, showed something unprecedented. Defensive positions were no longer holding for predicted timeframes. Reserves were being committed to crises that had already passed. Communication between defensive sectors was breaking down because no one could agree on what kind of war they were now fighting. Kessler's memoranda, once read with attention, were now ignored. He was predicting an enemy that no longer existed. By the first week of March 1945, the German High Command was in crisis. The methods Patton had pioneered were spreading across the entire Allied line. The Siegfried Line, designed to last for years, was being breached in days. Whole defensive networks were ceasing to function, not because they had been destroyed, but because they had been bypassed, isolated, and rendered irrelevant. From an idea once dismissed as reckless, the new American doctrine had become an institutional weapon. From an officer once threatened with relief, Patton had become indispensable. But the Germans were not finished. In Berlin on March 4th, a meeting was held that history would not learn about for 40 years. Senior Wehrmacht intelligence officers, Gestapo officials, and Waffen-SS commanders gathered to discuss the unexplainable American transformation. Among them was a man whose name still triggers debate among historians, a counterintelligence officer who had spent 18 months running agent networks against the Allies. He believed he had identified the source of Patton's success. He believed he could neutralize it, and he was preparing to send something across the lines that would shake the Western Front to its foundations. In Part 3, we will reveal the German counter-operation that nearly succeeded the American officer who became its target, and the single intercepted radio transmission that changed everything. We will discover why a defeated army with its homeland burning made one final desperate gamble. And we will witness the moment Werner Kessler, the analyst who had been wrong about everything for 2 months, finally understood what he was looking at and why that understanding came too late. The real war was just beginning. In Part 1, we saw how the Malmedy massacre transformed Patton's Third Army into something the Wehrmacht had never faced. In Part 2, we witnessed the formal demonstration at Bitburg that silenced his critics and spread his methods across the Allied front. We left with a German counter-operation forming in Berlin, designed to neutralize the American transformation before it could end the war. Now, in March 1945, that operation was unfolding. By the second week of March, German casualty reports across the Western Front had reached numbers no one in the Wehrmacht High Command wanted to read aloud. 41,000 soldiers killed, 63,000 wounded, over 120,000 captured in 30 days. The numbers were not just losses. They were a system collapsing in real time. And this was no longer a test. This was the end. The German response began with denial, then panic. On March 6, 1945, General Oberst Alfred Jodl convened an emergency intelligence session at Wehrmacht headquarters in Zossen. Around the table sat the men who had run Germany's war for 5 years. They were now staring at maps that no longer made sense. The Siegfried Line, the supposedly impregnable West Wall, was being penetrated at a rate of 8 to 12 kilometers per day. Defensive sectors were being bypassed faster than reserves could be committed. Werner Kessler, summoned from Army Group B to brief the assembled officers, presented his findings in clinical terms. The Americans were no longer attacking strongpoints. They were attacking gaps. They were no longer reducing fortifications. They were isolating them. Within days of being bypassed, defenders were running out of ammunition, food, and communication, and surrendering without fighting. The room sat in silence. Then Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, newly appointed commander of the Western Front, asked the question no one wanted to answer. How do we stop this? Kessler had no answer. The German counteroperation that emerged from this meeting was desperate and inventive. Special interrogation teams were dispatched to extract information from captured American officers about training methods. Counterintelligence units launched what they called Operation Habicht, an attempt to insert German speakers in American uniforms behind Patton's lines to disrupt command communications. 6 teams were sent across between March 8th and March 14th. 5 were captured within 72 hours. The 6th simply disappeared. By March 15th, German tank production had been redirected to emphasize defensive armor over offensive vehicles. Hetzer tank destroyers and Jagd Panthers were rushed to forward sectors. Engineer battalions worked through nights laying secondary minefields behind primary defensive lines. None of it worked fast enough. American casualties remained low. German casualties continued to climb. But the trouble was about to come from somewhere else entirely. The first serious crisis inside the American command came on March 12, 1945. Near the village of Bingen, a battalion from the 87th Infantry Division attempted a Bitburg-style rapid assault on a fortified rail junction. The attack failed, catastrophically. The lead company advanced too fast. They outran their own artillery support and their flanking armor. They hit a German anti-tank screen that had been hidden in farm buildings, and they were cut down in the open. 46 American soldiers died in less than 20 minutes. 103 were wounded. The battalion commander was killed, leading from the front. Reports of the disaster reached Schaeff the next morning. Within hours, the same critics who had been silenced after Bitburg were back. Eisenhower's Chief of Staff General Walter Bedell Smith sent a sharp cable to Patton's headquarters demanding an explanation. Newspapers in the United States, fed by leaks from Washington, began running stories questioning whether the new methods were causing unnecessary American deaths. A New York Times editorial on March 14th asked openly whether General Patton had become reckless. Inside Third Army, the reaction was equally severe. Junior officers began questioning whether the methods could be applied universally or whether they required specific conditions, specific units, specific leaders. Patton himself, according to his diary, considered the possibility that his approach had been pushed too far too fast. For the first time since January, he ordered a brief review of operational procedures. Was Bingen proof that the system was breaking? Was it proof that the war could not be won this way? The answer came not from a study or a memorandum, but from a battle. And what happened next would silence every critic permanently. The town was Mainz. The date was March 22, 1945. The strategic prize was the bridge across the Rhine. By March 22nd, the German army had pulled most of its surviving forces east of the Rhine River, the last great natural defensive barrier protecting the German homeland. The Mainz garrison numbered approximately 14,000 troops. They held the western city, the river crossings, and a series of dug-in positions on the eastern bank. The bridge itself had been wired for demolition since March 18th. Conventional Allied doctrine called for a 2-week assault preparation, massive air bombardment river crossing operations, using engineer bridging units, and methodical reduction of the garrison. Patton authorized 72 hours. The 11th Armored Division and elements of the 80th Infantry Division formed the assault force. The plan was simple and aggressive. Hit the city from 3 directions simultaneously. Punch through to the bridge before German engineers could complete the demolition wiring. Take the Eastern Bank in the same operation. The assault began at 0400 hours. Tanks rolled. Infantry followed. The first German outposts fell before they could even radio warnings. By 0530 hours, lead American elements were 3 kilometers inside the city. They moved through the streets like water finding cracks in a wall. Where they met resistance, they bypassed. Where they found openings, they exploited. German command and control collapsed within 90 minutes. Hauptmann Friedrich Heinemann, an artillery officer captured during the assault, later described what he saw. "We had positioned guns to fire on the western approaches. The Americans never came from the west. They came from the south, the north, and somehow from inside the city. Our communications failed. We did not know who was where. We did not know who was alive. We fired in directions we hoped were correct." By 700 hours, American tanks were within 400 meters of the bridge. The German engineers panicked, attempted the demolition 20 minutes too early. Half the charges failed. Half exploded harmlessly. The bridge held. By 0815 hours, the first American Sherman crossed onto the eastern bank. The eastern defensive positions, expecting hours of warning, were caught with men still cooking breakfast. By 1000 hours, a full American combat command had crossed. By 1300 hours, the eastern bridgehead extended over 6 kilometers deep. The Mainz garrison began surrendering en masse. Final tally for the operation: American killed 67, American wounded 240, German killed 891, German captured 11,416. Operation time 22 hours. Strategic impact incalculable. The Rhine had been crossed. The German homeland had been breached. The last natural defensive line of the Third Reich had been broken in less than a single day. Mainz proved what Bingen had not disproven. The methods worked. The disaster at Bingen had been a failure of execution, not concept. When applied with discipline, with proper coordination with the right tempo, the doctrine that had emerged from the Ardennes was unstoppable. News of the Mainz crossing reached Allied headquarters within hours. Eisenhower himself sent a personal cable of congratulations to Patton that afternoon. The cable, preserved in the Eisenhower archives, ended with a single line: "George, you have shortened this war by months." But the implications went far beyond a single bridge. Within 72 hours of Mainz, the entire Allied front was changing. The First Army under General Hodges had already established a Rhine bridgehead at Remagen on March 7th. Now, with Patton's crossing at Mainz on March 22nd, the British 21st Army Group accelerated its own crossing operations near Wesel, scheduled originally for March 24th, executed with greater aggression than originally planned. By March 28th, 6 separate Allied bridgeheads existed across the Rhine. The German High Command was no longer trying to defend the Rhine. They were trying to survive long enough to negotiate. The American war correspondents, including Ernie Pyle and Andy Rooney, filed stories that captured the imagination of the home front. Headlines in the United States shifted dramatically. Patton crosses Rhine. Third Army unstoppable. War's end in sight. The propaganda value was immense. Recruitment numbers, morale among existing units, war bond purchases, all surged in the final week of March. German radio intercepts revealed something even more important. Inside Wehrmacht units, desertions were now occurring at a rate 300% higher than at any previous point in the war. Entire companies were surrendering at first contact. Senior officers were destroying records, fleeing eastward, attempting to position themselves for capture by Western forces rather than Soviets. The strategic calculus had collapsed. Numerical comparisons told the story even more starkly. In December 1944, before the new methods, the average ratio of German to American casualties on the Western Front was 1.4 to 1. By late March 1945, that ratio had inverted to 13 to 1. American operational tempo had increased 400%. Territorial gains per week had increased 600%. German prisoner counts had increased 800%. The war that experts had predicted would last into 1946 was now expected to end before summer. Recognition followed. Patton was promoted to 4-star general on April 14, 1945. His Third Army received the Presidential Unit Citation for its operations from December 1944 through March 1945. Officers who had implemented his methods, men like Hap Gay John Wood and Creighton Abrams, received Distinguished Service Crosses and accelerated promotions. The methods themselves entered American military doctrine, permanently codified into training manuals that would shape the United States Army for the next 50 years. Werner Kessler, the German intelligence officer, who had spent 4 months trying to understand what he was seeing, was captured by American forces near Bamberg on April 18th. He cooperated fully with his interrogators. His final report, written in American captivity, contained a single sentence that historians have quoted ever since. "We were defeated not by superior numbers, but by an enemy who had a reason that was bigger than our orders." From an idea born in the frozen fields of Malmedy, from rage transformed into doctrine, from a general nearly relieved of command to one nearly knighted, the story had reached its battlefield climax. The Rhine was crossed. The Reich was breaking. The methods that critics had called insane in January were saving thousands of lives by April. But what about the man who had started it all? What happened to George Patton, the general who had walked up to the line and refused to cross it, who had unleashed his army's fury without losing its discipline, who had ended the war faster than anyone thought possible? The answer is one of the strangest, most troubling chapters in American military history. Because within 7 months of his greatest triumph, George S. Patton would be dead. Not in combat, not from illness. In a car accident on a quiet road in Germany, under circumstances that have generated conspiracy theories for 80 years. And the methods he pioneered, the doctrine that had won the Western Front, would be quietly modified, sanitized, and partially abandoned by the very army he had served. In Part 4, the final chapter of this story, we will reveal what happened in those final months. The suspicious circumstances of his death, the men who had reasons to want him, silenced the legacy that survived in unexpected places, and the single conversation between Patton and his nephew that has haunted historians for decades. The story is not finished. The truth is darker than the war. In Part 1, we witnessed how the Malmedy massacre transformed Patton's Third Army. In Part 2, we saw the formal demonstration at Bitburg silence his critics. In Part 3, we watched the Rhine crossing at Mainz break the German homeland and shorten the war by months. From an idea born in rage to a doctrine that crushed the Wehrmacht, the journey had reached its battlefield triumph. But what happened to the man who had started it all? What happened to George Patton, the general who had walked up to the line and refused to cross it? The story has a final twist that almost no one knows. Because success in the highest places sometimes comes with a price that no enemy could collect, but allies could. The war ended on May 8, 1945. For Patton, the victory he had helped engineer should have been the crown of a 40-year career. Instead, the months that followed became the strangest, most troubling chapter of his life. Initially, the recognition was overwhelming. He was promoted to 4-star general. He was hailed in American newspapers as one of the greatest battlefield commanders since Sherman. Crowds in Boston and Los Angeles greeted him with parades when he returned briefly in June. Children climbed onto his Jeep. Mothers held up photographs of sons who had served under him. Sons who had come home alive because of how fast the war had ended. But behind the public celebrations, the political situation was poisoning. Patton was assigned military governor of Bavaria, a role for which he was spectacularly unsuited. He clashed publicly with Eisenhower over denazification policies. He gave press interviews questioning the wisdom of dismantling German civil administration. He criticized Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe at a time when official policy required diplomatic restraint. By September 1945, He had been quietly relieved of his 3rd Army command and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper headquarters with no real combat function. The man who had broken the Siegfried Line was now writing historical reports. His diary entries from October and November 1945 reveal a man wrestling with disillusionment. He wrote of feeling shelved and unwanted. He wrote of younger officers who were now positioning themselves for post-war careers, distancing from his methods, sanitizing his legacy. Then, on December 9, 1945, on a quiet road near Mannheim, a military sedan carrying Patton was struck by a U.S. Army truck. The accident seemed routine. Patton's neck was broken, but he was conscious. He was transferred to a military hospital in Heidelberg. For 12 days he hovered between recovery and decline. On December 21, 1945, he died of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. He had survived 2 world wars to die in a hospital bed 7 months after Germany's surrender. His real legacy was about to be hidden, distorted, and partially erased. The doctrine Patton had created did not die with him, but it was changed almost beyond recognition in the decade that followed. The aggressive tempo, the willingness to bypass strong points, the trust extended to junior officers, all of it was studied at Fort Leavenworth and the Army War College through 1946 and 1947. Then the Cold War arrived, and the U.S. Army shifted toward defensive doctrines built around nuclear weapons and large set-piece engagements. The Patton method, as it came to be called, was reduced to a chapter in field manuals, then to a footnote, then nearly to a memory. But it never fully disappeared. In Korea, in 1950, a young officer named Creighton Abrams, who had served under Patton in the 4th Armored Division, applied the same principles in the breakout from Pusan. The advance to the Yalu River in October 1950 used tempo and bypass tactics nearly identical to those refined at Mines. In Vietnam, the same Abrams, now commanding all U.S. forces, attempted to apply Patton's emphasis on small unit aggression and decentralized decision-making. The political environment limited what was possible, but the doctrinal DNA remained. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, the doctrine returned in full force. General Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook maneuver, the rapid armored advance that destroyed Iraqi forces in just 100 hours, was studied beforehand using Patton's Rhineland campaign as the primary historical model. The total Iraqi casualties exceeded 100,000. American casualties numbered fewer than 300. The Patton ratio, refined and modernized, had returned. By the early 21st century, the doctrine had spread internationally. Israeli armored forces studied it. The British Army incorporated it. Even the Russian military, in its post-Soviet doctrinal reforms, examined Patton's Ardennes to Rhine campaign as a model of operational tempo. Modern military estimates suggest that the methods Patton pioneered when applied across the campaigns from 1945 through 2003 saved approximately 200,000 Western military lives by ending engagements faster, reducing exposure time, and overwhelming defenders before they could organize sustained resistance. The methodology became the foundation of what military theorists today call maneuver warfare, taught at every NATO staff college, applied in dozens of conflicts, and still evolving in the age of drone warfare and information operations. The deeper lessons of the Patton story, however, are not technical. They are human. The first lesson is about the source of innovation. Patton did not invent maneuver warfare from a textbook. He was forced into it by moral fury, by the need to respond to atrocity with overwhelming force, by the recognition that conventional doctrine was both too slow and too uncreative for the war he was actually fighting. The greatest tactical revolution of the Western Front emerged not from a strategic planning cell, but from a man reading reports of murdered prisoners and refusing to let their deaths mean nothing. The second lesson is about institutions. The U.S. Army nearly destroyed Patton 3 times during the war. After the slapping incident in Sicily, after the press leaks of late 1944, after the controversies over his methods in early 1945. Each time, the institutional reflex was to silence, sanitize, and standardize. Each time, only the urgency of war saved him. In peacetime, the institution finished what war could not. The third lesson is about courage. Not battlefield courage, which Patton possessed in excess, but the courage to be wrong publicly, to be ridiculed, to walk up to a line and trust your own judgment about where to stop. History remembers Patton for victories. It should remember him for the moral discipline that prevented atrocities he had every emotional reason to permit. He could have ordered reprisals. He could have winked at executions. He chose instead to channel rage into tempo fury, into doctrine, grief into mathematical aggression that killed enemies in combat, rather than after surrender. Other crazy innovations of the Second World War followed similar paths. The British dam-busting bouncing bomb dismissed as fantasy until it destroyed the Ruhr industrial valley. The American proximity fuse, considered impossible until it shattered Japanese air attacks. The Soviet deep battle doctrine mocked by Western planners until it crushed Army Group Center. Each of these came from individuals who refused to accept that the existing way of fighting was the only way. But there is one final detail of the Patton story that almost no one knows. In 2008, the U.S. Army Center of Military History declassified a series of personal letters Patton had written to his nephew, Frederick Ayer Jr., during the autumn of 1945. The letters written in October and November reveal a Patton no one knew. In one letter, dated November 4, 1945, Patton wrote about the men who had died at Malmedy. He wrote that he thought of them every night. He wrote that he had ordered photographs of the bodies taken by recovery teams in December 1944, kept in his personal files. He wrote that he had carried one of those photographs of an unidentified American sergeant lying in the snow with his hands still raised in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket throughout the entire campaign from January through May 1945. He wrote that on the day he crossed the Rhine at Mainz, he had taken the photograph out of his pocket, looked at it, and said aloud, "We did this for you." The photograph was found among his personal effects after his death. It was returned unidentified to the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. It was eventually buried with the unknown American dead at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, where many of the Malmedy victims now lie. The man whose murder no one ever solved, whose name was never recovered, was carried through the campaign that ended the war by the general who refused to forget him. That is the part of the story that almost no one tells. From a frozen field outside Malmedy, where 84 American boys died with their hands raised to a Rhine crossing that broke the Third Reich in 22 hours. The journey of George Patton's final campaign was the journey of rage transformed into discipline, of grief transformed into doctrine, of personal fury, channeled into a methodology that would save lives for generations. Patton proved that the most dangerous army is not the one with the most weapons, but the one with a reason it refuses to release. The methods he pioneered shortened the war in Europe by months, saved tens of thousands of Allied lives, and shaped military doctrine for the next 80 years. 200,000 Western soldiers across a half-century of conflicts came home alive because of decisions made in a frozen command post in Luxembourg City in January 1945. If you know a story like this, a moment when one person's refusal to accept the impossible changed everything, share it in the comments. There are hundreds of innovations from the Second World War that we still have not told. Subscribe to discover the ones history almost forgot. Because, in the end, courage is not the absence of fear. It is the presence of a reason bigger than fear. And as long as men remember what they are fighting for, no fortress, no army, no enemy on earth can stop them.